Fog drifted over the asphalt, hiding the potholes in the road. Detective Frank Donovan slowed the speed of his shabby 2,000-year-old Ford, peering through the moldering mailboxes for the right address. The sleepy Monday morning tasted of last night's whiskey and the bitterness of cheap coffee bought at a gas station. Frank rubbed his tired eyes. At 48, he felt like 60, especially on mornings like this, when the call of the desk clerk snapped him out of a brief, restless slumber. 26 Clover Street. Donovan stopped the car near a gnarled fence, behind which he could see a tiny one-story house, one of those cheap prefab houses that were rented out for a pittance to commuters or the very poor. The white paint on the walls had long since peeled off, revealing gray boards like wounds on a body. How ironic, Frank thought, looking at the plastic swans that adorned the tiny front garden, a symbol of eternal love outside the house where that love had lasted only 3 days. 2 patrol cars, a medical examiner's van, and a few gawkers were already parked in front of the house, restrained by a young uniformed officer. Donovan sighed. In the small town of Riverdale, with a population of less than 10,000, murder was a rarity, and each one became a topic of discussion for months. "Detective," the patrolman nodded to him, lifting the yellow tape of the cordon. The yellow tape was an alien element to this neighborhood. It only showed up here when things were going badly. At the trailer park south of town, yeah, it was a frequent visitor. But not here. Not in the neighborhood where young families and retirees settled. As she crossed the threshold, Donovan cringed at the pungent odor, a heavy mixture of blood, sweat, and fear. A smell you never forget, no matter how many years you've been on the force. He walked slowly through the tiny hallway into the living room, mentally noting the details: the overturned table in the hallway, the broken picture frame on the floor, the fist marks in the wall near the door. Someone had been very angry before entering the room. Sarah Miller was lying on the living room floor, arms spread out as if in a final embrace. She was wearing a simple floral homemade dress, now soaked in blood. Her blonde hair was strewn across the floor, partially hiding her face, swollen with a huge bruise on her right cheekbone and a split lip. The girl's eyes, blue as Frank would later learn from the paperwork, were wide open, but could no longer see anything. "Who discovered her?" Donovan asked, putting on latex gloves. "A neighbor, Mrs. Baker," replied Officer Parker, the young policeman who had first arrived on the scene. "She heard the screams about 10 o'clock last night, but didn't call the police. Figured the Newlyweds were just having a fight. Then this morning I went in to borrow some flour and found this. Donovan nodded. Classic. People prefer not to get involved until it's too late. Medical examiner Martha Chen, a small woman with a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue, squatted beside the body, taking notes. Death was due to internal bleeding caused by multiple injuries, she said without looking up. 4 ribs broken, one of them punctured a lung. But that's not what killed her. The main cause was a ruptured spleen and liver. She was beaten long and expertly. Time of death? Between 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock last night. I'll be more specific after the autopsy." Frank walked slowly around the room, mentally reconstructing the scene. The broken vase, the overturned coffee table, the shattered glass under the couch. She fought back. There were photographs on the mantelpiece, very recent by the look of them. Wedding pictures. Sarah in a simple white dress, smiling for the camera, next to her a tall guy with short dark hair and stubble. Must be her husband, Ray Miller. He looks happy, holding his wife by the waist possessively but proudly. Donovan took the photograph in his hands, taking in the faces. What had happened in those 3 days between the wedding and death? Sitting in a plastic chair in the police station, Ray Miller looked like a man whose whole world had collapsed overnight. His broad mechanic's shoulders now slouched, his hands, strong with machine grease under his fingernails, hung powerlessly between his knees. His eyes, reddened either from crying or sleep deprivation, were staring at a single point on the wall. Donovan studied him through the glass partition before entering. 27 years old, auto mechanic at Thompson's garage, married since Saturday. Now a widower, and prime suspect. "Mr. Miller," Frank sat across from me, placing a thin folder of preliminary case files on the table. "I'm Detective Donovan. I'm very sorry for your loss." Ray looked up, tired, but without the spark of panic Donovan often saw in the guilty. "I didn't kill her." His voice was hoarse, as if he'd been screaming for hours. "I would never. Sarah was everything to me. Tell me where you were last night, between 9 and 11. Ray ran his hand over his face, gathering his thoughts. "I was in the garage. Sarah and I, had a fight after dinner. It wasn't anything serious, it was just—" He stammered. "She wanted to go to work, even though we'd agreed she'd take a week off, for the honeymoon. And she was called in to fill in, and she took it." Ray was silent, going over the details of that evening, which now seemed so distant and unreal. He remembered how he'd come home from his shift at the garage and brought a bouquet of wildflowers, not the most expensive, but Sarah loved them. How happy she had been, put them in a vase and told him about the call from the cafe. "The shift is tomorrow. Lisa is sick, and no one else can go out." How angry he'd gotten. Not at her. No, at the situation. This was their week, their time, together, finally as a family. And now, "I'm pissed," Ray admitted, looking down at the table. Slamming the door, he got in his car and drove back to the garage. "Sometimes when I'm nervous, I need to do something with my hands. Tinker with engines, It's, calming." Donovan understood. Everyone has their own way of dealing with demons. He preferred to drown them in whiskey, even though he knew it wasn't the best choice. "Can anyone confirm that you were in the garage?" "No." Ray shook his head. "I was alone. I have the keys. Thompson trusts me. I must have worked there for, till midnight, maybe longer. Then I went to a friend's house, Mike. Didn't want to come home until we both cooled off." "And you didn't come home?" "No." Ray's eyes filled with pain again. "If I did, if I hadn't left at all, maybe she'd still be alive." Donovan made notes in his notebook. The alibi is weak, almost non-existent. And there's a motive. Jealousy, a fight. But there was something in this guy's eyes that made him doubt it. Donovan had seen a lot of killers in his career, some repentant, some lying, some believing in their right to kill. But all he saw in Ray's eyes was the pain of loss and the confusion of a man who'd lost his footing. "Tell me about Sarah," Donovan asked, leaning back in his chair. "What was she like?" At the mention of his wife's name, Ray's face softened, and a shadow of a smile flashed in his eyes, but it was immediately replaced by the realization of her absence. Sarah was special, bright, always smiling at customers in cafes, memorizing who liked what. Dreamed of opening her own little cafe someday. She was saving up for a pastry chef course. Ray hesitated, choosing his words. Sarah Evans, now Miller, had come into his life 5 months ago, bringing with her a light and warmth that had been sorely lacking. He'd fallen in love instantly when she'd brought him coffee and apple pie at Joe's cafe, where he'd gone for lunch after his shift. It took him a long time to work up the courage to ask her out. Their relationship grew rapidly. 2 months later, he proposed, unable to imagine life without her. "We were planning children." Ray's voice trembled. "Sarah wanted a daughter. We even picked out a name, Emma." Donovan looked at the tough guy, who was barely holding back tears now, and felt the doubt building inside. If Ray did kill his wife, either he's the greatest actor on earth or there's something in their story he doesn't understand yet. Jenny Welsh tapped her fingernails nervously on the countertop as she sat in interrogation room 2. Unlike Ray, she wasn't considered a suspect, and the conversation was in the format of a witness interview. But Donovan had deliberately chosen a formal setting. Sometimes the sterility of police walls made people tell the truth better than threats. "So you worked the same shift as Sarah?" "Yes." Jenny was thin, even gaunt, with short red hair and lots of freckles on her pale face. "Almost 2 years together." "And friends?" Jenny hesitated to answer, just for a second, but Donovan noticed the pause. "As friendly as you could be with a coworker," she shrugged. "We worked together, had a few drinks after shift. She told me a lot about herself." "Like what?" "About her family in Ohio, ex-boyfriends, about wanting to get out of this town." Jenny crossed her arms over her chest. "Sarah was, a dreamer, always looking for something more." Donovan could detect a hint of envy in the girl's words. It was common for a beautiful co-worker who attracted everyone's attention to often evoke ambivalent feelings. How had she met Ray? He used to frequent the coffee shop, the mechanic from the garage across the street. He fell in love right away. Jenny grinned, but without malice. Sarah said he was reliable, that he made her feel safe. What did you think of their relationship? Jenny paused again, as if weighing whether to be honest. Honestly, I didn't understand why she chose him. She had a lot of suitors, some with a lot more to offer than a provincial mechanic, like Kevin. Kevin? Donovan stepped forward. Kevin Thompson, trucker, regular customer. He was crazy about Sarah. It was obvious to everyone. And he had more money than Ray. Drives all over the country. Could have picked her up from here. Donovan made a note in his notebook. Was Sarah reciprocating his feelings? I don't know. Jenny shrugged. She was flirting with him, that's for sure. But Sarah flirted with everyone. It's part of being a waitress. The nicer you are to the customers, the bigger the tip. In his mind, Donovan drew a portrait of the victim. A young, attractive girl stuck in a small town, dreaming of a bigger life. Married to a local guy but perhaps kept looking for better options? Classic motive for a crime of passion? How did Ray feel about Sarah's work? About her socializing with other men? Jenny chewed her lip as she considered the answer. He was jealous, of course, especially of Kevin. A couple times he'd come in before the end of her shift and sat at the table watching. But he kept his hands to himself, if that's what you mean. At least Sarah never complained about the abuse. Were you at the wedding? Yes, Jenny nodded. On Saturday, a small celebration at the Blue Horseshoe Bar, just close friends. Was Kevin there too? No, I mean, he was invited, but he didn't show up. Said he was going on a road trip. Donovan made another note. How was the wedding? Jenny wrinkled her nose a little, remembering. It was fine. Drinks, dancing, the usual toasts. Ray had a little too much to drink and made a scene when one of the guests took too long to dance with Sarah, but it was quickly hushed up. This guest, who is he? Danny Foster, Sarah's cousin, came all the way from Cincinnati for the wedding. Donovan nodded, making a mental note to check on this man as well. When was the last time you saw Sarah? Yesterday afternoon, Jenny tensed. She stopped by the cafe, even though it was her day off. Said Ray had called her in for a talk in the garage, wanted to have coffee beforehand. What did she look like? Anxious? Not anxious. More like determined. She said something along the lines of, "We need to set the record straight." And you don't know what she was talking about? Jenny shook her head, but Donovan saw the way she averted her eyes. There was something she wasn't telling him. Miss Welch, Donovan moved forward, trying to catch her eye. If you know anything about what might have happened between Sarah and Ray, now would be a good time to tell me. Jenny sighed, nervously rubbing the sleeve of her sweater. There were rumors that Sarah was dating Kevin, in a romantic sense, I mean, not just flirting at work. Is that true? I don't know, Jenny shrugged. Maybe it's just gossip. People like to make up stories, especially about people like Sarah. Like her? Pretty, bright, someone who stands out in a crowd. Donovan noticed Jenny's voice trembled slightly. Definitely envy, maybe even jealousy, but strong enough to be a motive for murder? He made another note. Do you know if Sarah had a meeting with anyone last night? After she left the cafe? Jenny shook her head, but too quickly, as if she'd prepared that answer in advance. No, she said she was going home to make dinner for Ray. But something in her eyes made Donovan doubt the sincerity of those words. It was nearing evening when Donovan parked at Joe's roadside cafe, the little place on the edge of town where Sarah Miller worked. The place looked typical of such towns. Shabby vinyl booths, a long counter, the smell of coffee and fried bacon. The owner, a heavy-set man with a mustache and a perpetually tired look, was wiping glasses behind the counter. What can I do for you? He asked when Donovan showed his badge. Joe Higgins? I'm here about Sarah Miller. The owner sighed heavily, shaking his head. It's a terrible story. Such a young girl. I'm trying to understand what happened in the last days of her life. Did she come here yesterday? Yeah, she stopped by this afternoon. Not on her shift. Had coffee, talked to Jenny. Did she seem worried? Joe shrugged. Wouldn't say. Just the usual Sarah, smiling, lively. Said she'd been called in to fill in today, asked if she could take the shift tomorrow too. But she just got married, Donovan pointed out. Isn't it weird to ask for extra shifts on your honeymoon? Joe hesitated. Maybe, but Sarah needed the money. She always took extra shifts when she could. For what? Did she say? She wanted to save up for pastry school, dreamed of opening her own cafe someday. Donovan looked around. The cafe was almost empty, just a couple of truckers in the far corner and an elderly couple at the window. Do you know Kevin Thompson? Sure, Joe nodded. Regular customer. Stops here every time his route takes him through town. Nice guy, generous with his tips. Did he show any interest in Sarah? Joe hesitated, clearly not wanting to gossip. Look, detective, my cafe is full of truckers, and most of them are single men. Of course they look at the pretty waitresses. It's part of life. But Kevin was a special case? He was, yeah, maybe. Always sat at her tables, often stayed through his shift. Gave her earrings once. Nothing fancy, but still. I warned Sarah to be careful, didn't want any trouble. Did Ray know about this? I'm sure he did, Joe sighed. Small town, detective. Everyone here knows everything. Is Kevin in town right now? He should be. Saw his truck in the parking lot yesterday. Blue Peterbilt with Transcontinental on the side. Donovan nodded, making a note. One more question. Do you know if Sarah went out with anyone last night? After work? Joe looked embarrassed, beginning to wipe his already clean glass vigorously. I don't keep track of my employees' personal lives, detective. But did you see something? Joe hesitated, then reluctantly answered, I left late, around 9 o'clock. Saw Sarah at the truck stop across the street. She was sitting in the cab of a blue Peterbilt. In Kevin's truck? Yeah, Joe averted his eyes. But I don't meddle in other people's business, detective. If Sarah's husband did something. We don't know who did it yet, Donovan interrupted him. And I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't share your hunches with anyone else. It could hurt the investigation. Joe nodded, still avoiding a direct look. Of course, detective. I understand. Anna Petrowski, the elderly woman from across the street, was happy to invite the detective to tea. For people like her, lonely pensioners, a police investigation was the most exciting thing in years. They moved into that cottage on Sunday, the day after their wedding, she said, setting cookies on the table. Such a beautiful couple. He carried things and she told him where to put things, laughing like children the whole time. Donovan nodded, making notes in his notebook. And then? Did you notice anything unusual? Mrs. Petrowski hesitated, adjusting her glasses on the bridge of her nose. That same evening I heard them arguing. Nothing serious, just raised voices. You can hear everything in such thin walls. He said something about his parents, that they should visit them. She didn't seem to want to. Anything else? Monday morning saw her leaving quite early, dressed in her work uniform. Pink dress with a white apron, the kind the girls at Joe's cafe wear. And in the evening. The old woman was silent, as if in doubt. What happened that night, Mrs. Petrowski? I saw them through the window. They were fighting again, more seriously. He was waving his arms around, then he slammed his fist into the wall, and she did? She was laughing at him. You know, that, mocking laugh, like she was provoking him. I thought it was wrong to talk to my husband like that. Donovan made another note. The image of Sarah was becoming more and more contradictory. Cute waitress or calculating manipulator? And after the fight? He stormed out of the house, slamming the door. He got in his truck and drove away, and she stayed home. Did you see anyone come to see her afterward? Mrs. Petrowski looked away, and Donovan sensed she wasn't telling him the truth. I don't want to speak ill of the dead. Mrs. Petrowski, Donovan said softly. This is a murder case. Any information can help us find the culprit. The woman sighed. About an hour after her husband left, a car pulled up in front of her. A big blue truck. She got out, talked to the driver, then got into his cab. She came back a half hour later, maybe a little more. Are you sure it wasn't the husband? Positive. Ray drives an old pickup truck, and this was a big rig, the kind of trucker that truckers drive. Kevin Thompson. Another confirmation of their meeting. Donovan thanked Mrs. Petrowski for the information and headed to his next target, the truck stop. Kevin Thompson sat on the steps of his truck, smoking a cigarette and watching the detective approach with the wariness of an animal that sensed danger. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and cold gray eyes, he looked like a man who had seen enough trouble in his life to distrust the police. Detective Frank Donovan, Riverdale PD. Frank showed his badge. I need to ask you some questions about Sarah Miller. The trucker's face contorted for a moment at the mention of that name, but he quickly regained control. Heard what happened to her, he said in a muffled voice. It's a damn shame. She was a good girl. When was the last time you saw her? Kevin hesitated, taking a drag on his cigarette, clearly buying time. Am I a suspect? Just a witness. For now, Donovan clarified. I know that you met with Sarah on Monday night around 8 o'clock, outside her house. And earlier that day in this parking lot. Kevin threw the cigarette butt away, stomping it out with his heavy shoe. Okay, yeah, we've seen each other. Why? To talk. She called, said she needed to meet, that it was important. What was the conversation about? Kevin cringed, as if the memory hurt him physically. Wanted to set the record straight. Said she loved her husband and that it was over between us. Was there a beginning? The trucker was silent for almost a minute, and Donovan didn't rush him. Sometimes silence was the best way to get an answer. Yes, Kevin finally said. We were in a relationship. Nothing serious. A couple dates, a few nights. But for me, it was more than that. Donovan scrutinized the face of the man in front of him. Behind the rough exterior was real pain. And when had this relationship started? 3 months ago, I came into town as usual. I went to a coffee shop. Sarah was waiting on my table. We got to talking. Then I asked her out for a drink after work. Kevin was silent, lost in his memories. He didn't tell the detective about how he'd been struck by her laugh, how he'd felt something real for the first time in years of loneliness on the roads, how he dreamed that one day Sarah might travel with him, how they would see the whole country together. I thought we were serious, he continued. But then she started dating this mechanic, Ray. Said she felt safer with him, that he could give her a home, a family, things I couldn't give her with my job. And you accepted that? Kevin grinned wickedly. What choice did I have? Force her? He looked directly into Donovan's eyes. I loved her. I wanted her to be happy. If her happiness was being with someone else, well. But you kept seeing each other. Sometimes, when I came into town. Just to talk, nothing more. And Monday? What did you talk about other than it's over? Kevin tensed, looked away. She said she was afraid, that Ray wasn't who he said he was, that he controlled her every move, jealous of everyone around him, didn't want her working at the cafe. Did she talk about violence? No, Kevin shook his head. Not directly, but she was scared. I offered to take her away with me. I told her I could pick her up anytime, take her far away from here. And what did she say? She said she'd think about it, that she had some things she needed to take care of before she left. I gave her my number, told her I'd be in the parking lot till Wednesday. Donovan made a note. A picture was starting to emerge. Where were you last night between 9 o'clock and 11 p.m.? Here in the parking lot. I slept in the cab. I can show you my rest log. We truckers are required to keep one. Can anyone verify that? The owner of the parking lot, I guess. I didn't go anywhere. Donovan nodded. Another weak alibi to check out. Last question. You said Sarah was afraid of Ray, but at the same time you don't think he might have been capable of murder? Kevin hesitated, running his palm over the stubble on his chin. Honestly, I don't. Sarah said he had a temper, but he was resilient, that he never laid a hand on her. I'd seen him a few times at the cafeteria. Regular guy, nothing special, but, when it comes to jealousy, people change. They become capable of things they never would have thought possible. Donovan nodded understandingly. In his years of practice, most murders were committed not by hardened criminals, but by ordinary people in a moment of great emotional distress. Back at the station, Donovan found his partner, Detective Rodriguez, studying the case file. I found something interesting, he said, adjusting his glasses. Ray Miller had a criminal record 5 years ago. Bar fight, serious bodily injury. Got off with probation because the victim started the fight first. Donovan took the police report sheet his partner handed him. Reason? Girl? Rodriguez shrugged. Some waitress from the bar. Ray was dating her and the guy decided to hit on her. Word got out, and it was on. Witnesses say Ray literally went berserk, beat the guy so bad he spent 2 weeks in the hospital. Donovan studied the report, trying to connect that Ray Miller, the jealous boyfriend who had beaten his rival to a pulp, to the man he'd seen yesterday, grief-stricken, confused, lost everything. What about the trucker's alibi? Partially corroborated, Rodriguez replied. The owner of the parking lot says he saw his truck all night, but he didn't see Kevin. Could have left on foot or in a cab. What about the friend Ray was supposedly spending the night with? Mike Donahue confirms that Ray showed up at his place around midnight, drunk as a skunk, and stayed until morning. Donovan frowned. The timing doesn't add up. Sarah was killed between 9 and 11 p.m. Where was Ray during that interval? What about Sarah's things? Did you find anything interesting? Rodriguez nodded. Actually, yes. Found a small suitcase in the closet, almost completely packed. Women's clothes, hygiene items, some cash, about $500. It looked like she was planning to leave. Donovan tapped his pencil thoughtfully on the desk. Sarah was planning an escape, from her husband, with Kevin, or alone, in search of a better life. Jenny Welsh was called back to the station, but this time she looked even more nervous than before. Pale, red-rimmed eyes, clearly hadn't slept a night. Miss Welsh, Donovan began, yesterday you didn't tell me everything you know. I now have evidence that Sarah was planning to leave town, that she was in a relationship with Kevin Thompson, and that she was afraid of her husband. Jenny was silent, looking at the floor. If you're hiding something, it could qualify as obstruction, the detective added. I don't want to get you in trouble, but I need the truth. The girl took a deep breath, raising her eyes. You don't understand. Sarah wasn't afraid of Ray. She used him, just like everyone else. What do you mean? Sarah always got what she wanted. Men. They went crazy around her. They'd do anything to make her smile at them. Ray, Kevin, even Joe, the owner of the cafe, old enough to be her father, but he melted when she showed up for work. There was a lingering resentment in Jenny's voice, not just the professional jealousy of a coworker, but something deeper, more personal. She'd dated Kevin while she was engaged to Ray, bragged about the gifts he gave her, how he promised to get her out of this dump, and then she'd take flowers from Ray and tell him how wonderful he was, how happy she was to marry him. So why had she chosen Ray over Kevin? Jenny grinned sadly. Ray seemed more reliable. His own workshop, a steady income, a house on the horizon. Kevin was a tumbleweed, here today, gone tomorrow. Sarah said she'd marry Ray first, get settled, and then... She hesitated. And then what? And then she'd get divorced and take half of everything? She'd even joked about it, that in a year she'd be a wealthy divorced woman and could open her own cafe. Donovan listened, feeling a heaviness growing inside. Sarah Miller was emerging more and more as a calculating, manipulative woman who played on men's feelings. But then why the packing? She wasn't going to get divorced 3 days after the wedding, was she? Jenny lowered her head. Things had changed lately. Ray had become more controlling, checking her phone, jealous of every visitor. Sarah was afraid he'd found out something about Kevin. Monday, she showed up at the diner a wreck. She said Ray had found messages from Kevin on her phone and made a scene. What kind of messages? I don't know exactly, but Sarah said he was furious, that she'd never seen him like that before. And she decided to leave with Kevin? Yes, Jenny nodded. She called him, arranged to meet him, said she'd pack her things and leave with him on Wednesday when Ray was at work. Donovan thought about it. The story was getting clearer and clearer. A young wife planning an elopement with her lover 3 days after the wedding. Husband finding out about the affair. Classic motive for murder. One more thing, Jenny added, nervously tugging at her sleeve. Sarah, she knew how I felt about Kevin, and she was still having an affair with him in front of me. Even let me see their texts a couple times. It was like enjoying it, that he chose her over me. New twist. Jenny's in love with Kevin, hurt that he chose Sarah over her. Another potential motive. You were at the cafe all Monday night? Yeah, until closing time at 10. Can anyone confirm that? Sure, Joe. The other waitresses. Customers. I was in the lounge when the call came in that Sarah... Jenny didn't finish her sentence, but Donovan understood. A solid alibi, much more solid than Ray's or Kevin's. Evening found Donovan in his office, surrounded by photographs, reports, and deposition transcripts. There was an open bottle of whiskey on the desk, against the rules, but tonight he made an exception. A mosaic of the last hours of Sarah Miller's life was unfolding before him. It had all started with the wedding on Saturday, a modest celebration at a local bar. Even then, according to witnesses, the relationship between the newlyweds hadn't been perfect. Ray was jealous. Sarah flirted with the guests, as if testing the limits of his patience. Day 1, Sunday. The happy couple moves into a tiny rental house. The neighbors see them laughing, in love. But in the evening, the first big fight. Ray wants to introduce Sarah to his parents. She refuses. Why? Afraid of their judgment? Or was she already planning to disappear? Day 2, Monday. In the morning, Sarah, contrary to the honeymoon arrangement, goes to work. Ray is unhappy but resigned. In the afternoon, however, he finds messages from Kevin on her phone, possibly discussing escape plans. In the evening, a new fight, this time more violent. Ray leaves the house in a rage, driving to the garage, then to a friend's house. And what does Sarah do? After her husband leaves, she meets with Kevin, discusses the details of the escape, then comes home, starts packing, and someone comes to her place between 9 o'clock and 11 p.m. Donovan set about reconstructing the murder scene based on evidence and testimony. Sarah's home alone, hears a knock on the door, opens it. It's someone she knows or she wouldn't have let in. Conversation begins calmly, but quickly escalates into conflict. Sarah, judging by her character, is not the type to keep quiet or be afraid. She's more likely to provoke, to mock. The quarrel grows more and more violent. Sarah might threaten to leave, say something embarrassing, or confessing to an affair, plans to run away. Her interlocutor loses control. First blow, she recoils, but she doesn't give up. She laughs, continues to provoke. More blows, now uncontrollable in a blind rage. When it's over, Sarah is lying on the living room floor. Her killer, realizing what has happened, leaves the house in a panic. But who was it? Ray, a husband with a history of abuse who found out about the affair. Kevin, the lovesick trucker she told she'd changed her mind about leaving with him? Or Jenny, suffering from unrequited love for Kevin and hating her rival. Each had a motive, each had opportunity, and no one has a solid alibi. Sarah Miller took the answer with her, at least for now. Wednesday was overcast, with low leaden clouds ready to rain. Detective Donovan stood at the window of his office, looking out over the dreary landscape of the small town. The Sarah Miller case was keeping him busy. 3 suspects, 3 motives, and no conclusive evidence. He returned to the table where the case files were spread out. Frank decided to dig deeper into each of the suspects' backgrounds. Perhaps there was a clue lurking there. Ray Miller had grown up in a home where violence was the norm. His father, a hereditary miner who lost his job because the mine closed, took his anger out on his wife and son. Ray had several records of fights in his school file, but teachers often turned a blind eye. Everyone knew the family situation. At 16, he left home, lived with friends, worked part-time in auto repair shops. At 22, he got a criminal record for that very bar fight. No priors since. 5 years of clean living, stable job, good reviews from neighbors and co-workers. Donovan looked at his high school photo, a lean, wary teenager with a black eye and a stubborn stare. The look of a man used to defending himself against the world. Rodriguez brought new information, a bank account in Ray Miller's name. A modest sum, but it had been accumulating for years. $8,000, exactly as much as the owner of a small machine shop on the outskirts of the city asked for his business. Ray's dream was to have his own business, something he'd been working toward all these years, saving every extra dollar, and Sarah knew about it. What if she was planning to disappear with his savings? Kevin Thompson was more complicated. Ex-military, served 2 tours of duty in hot spots. Came back with no visible wounds, but with that invisible burden carried by all who have seen war. Roads became his salvation. Endless movement, lulling hum of the engine, constant change of places and faces. No attachments, no obligations. Until he met Sarah. She was like a sudden light at the end of the tunnel for him, bright, alive, laughing. Someone capable of piercing the armor behind which he'd been hiding from the world. Donovan studied Kevin's medical records. post-traumatic stress disorder, recurrent panic attacks, insomnia, prescribed medications that he often ignored. The psychologist noted a tendency to anger outbursts, although in everyday life Kevin gave the impression of a calm person. What if the news that Sarah had changed her mind about leaving with him was the last straw? Jenny Welsh's story was more prosaic, but no less tragic. The daughter of a single mom, raised in the shadow of more successful and beautiful girls, always second, always on the sidelines, diligent but inconspicuous. Her infatuation with Kevin was obvious to everyone but the trucker himself. For 3 years, she waited for his visits, memorized his favorite dishes, laughed at his jokes. And all the while, he'd looked past her, first at the other waitresses, then at Sarah. Donovan found dozens of photos on her social media accounts with Kevin's blue truck flashing in the background. Breathtaker, secret admirer. And then came Sarah. Bright, eye-catching, making no effort to please. And she got Kevin's attention for no reason at all. Could this quiet girl with red hair and freckles hold a deadly grudge? Could years of jealousy have turned into an act of violence? The key element turned out to be a chance find. An elderly neighbor living 2 houses away from the crime scene had installed a surveillance camera after his garden gnomes had been stolen twice. An ancient device with a blurry picture and no sound, but still. The recording showed the road in front of the Miller's house between 8 Monday night and midnight, and here's the key shot. 9:30, Ray's familiar pickup truck pulls up to the house. The driver sits behind the wheel for a few minutes, then resolutely gets out and heads for the door. The image quality didn't allow us to make out a face, but the silhouette and gait were distinctive. At 10:15, the same man runs out of the house, gets in his car, and drives away. Ray Miller lied about his alibi. He was coming home at the same time Sarah was killed. The second interrogation was different. Ray no longer looked crushed by grief, rather wary, ready to defend himself. "We know you came home that night," Donovan began without preamble. "The neighbor's camera caught your pickup at 9:30. Ray was silent, staring at his hands, the large, calloused hands of a working man, hands that could fix a motor or break human bones. "Why did you lie?" "I didn't kill her," Ray said hoarsely. "Yeah, I came back. I wanted to make up. We had a stupid fight and I wanted to apologize." "What happened?" Ray looked up, his eyes red from sleep or tears. "She wasn't home. I waited for almost an hour. Then I left for Mike's." "At 10:15, Donovan clarified, just as the medical examiner had ruled Sarah's death. "I don't know where she was." Ray's voice was desperate. "Maybe with him, with that trucker of his. You think I didn't know? The whole town knew. Everybody was laughing behind my back. Poor Ray. His wife messing around with Kevin. And that didn't make you angry?" "Of course it did." Ray pounded his fist on the table. "But I loved her. I thought things would get better after the wedding. That she'd settle down. And when you realized that wasn't going to happen?" Ray was silent for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "Monday morning. I found messages on her phone. She was planning to run off with him, take my money, everything I'd been saving for the workshop. I freaked out, yeah. We had a fight. But I didn't touch her, I swear." Donovan scrutinized his face. Ray was telling the truth, or at least he believed what he was saying. That same day, a new detail surfaced. In Sarah's purse, they found a bank card in Ray Miller's name with a PIN number written on the back of the check, and a printout of his account balance, $8,000. His lifelong dream, packed in a suitcase along with her belongings. Kevin's interrogation took on a more tense atmosphere. The trucker was withdrawn, one-word answers. "Did you know that Sarah was planning to take her husband's money?" Kevin grimaced. "She'd said she'd take what she was owed, that she'd worked for a pittance all her life and deserved better." The $8,000 Ray had been saving for years? "I didn't get into the details," Kevin snapped. "She said she'd take her share, that's between them. When did you agree to leave?" "Wednesday. I was supposed to pick her up at 10 in the morning when Ray was at work." "And where were you planning on going?" "Out west. California, maybe." She'd always wanted to see the ocean. Donovan noticed the tremor in Kevin's voice at those words. A dream that was never meant to come true. What if she'd changed her mind? What if she'd decided at the last minute to stay with her husband? Kevin's face petrified. She wouldn't have changed her mind. She hated this town, wanted more. But if she had, then I'd go off on my own. Kevin shrugged, like he always did. Something in his tone made Donovan hesitate. The man was used to loss, but losing Sarah might be the one thing he couldn't get over. Jenny had been called in for a third interrogation after one of the cafe patrons had reported an important detail. She hadn't been in the room for almost 40 minutes on Monday night. She had allegedly gone out for some air and returned agitated. "Why did you lie about your alibi?" Jenny nervously rubbed a strand of red hair. "I didn't lie. I was in the cafe the whole shift." 40 minutes between 9 and 10 p.m., Donovan clarified. Right around the time Sarah was killed. "I went out for a smoke," Jenny repeated stubbornly. "It's not forbidden." 40 minutes? For a cigarette? Jenny was silent, biting her lip. "Miss Welch," Donovan stepped forward. "We can check out where you went. Cameras, witnesses. If you were at Sarah's house—" "I wasn't there," Jenny exclaimed. "I went to the truck stop. I wanted to talk to Kevin." Donovan tensed. A new twist. "About what?" "About Sarah. That she was using him like she used everyone else. That she'd take Ray's money and dump him as soon as she found someone better. And how had he reacted?" Jenny lowered her eyes. Angry. Said I was a jealous loser. That Sarah was 100 times better than me. That I'd never be like her." Her voice shook with barely held back tears. "I loved him for 3 years. 3 years I waited for every time he came to visit. And he couldn't even remember my name. And Sarah, she just wagged her finger, and he ran after her like a dog." Donovan watched the transformation of the quiet, inconspicuous girl into a woman filled with rage and resentment. "You were at the truck stop until what time?" "I don't know." Jenny shrugged. "Maybe half an hour. Then I went back to the cafe. You can ask Joe." "And Kevin stayed in the parking lot the whole time?" "Yeah, he didn't even get out of the cab. He sat there, pissed as hell." New piece of the puzzle. If Kevin was in the parking lot at the time of the murder, the fingerprint analysis on Ray's bank card found in the house solved everything. In addition to Ray and Sarah's prints, there was another partial, smudged, but still identifiable. Kevin Thompson's print. The final interrogation of the trucker was no longer like a conversation with a witness, but like an interrogation of a suspect. Kevin sat across from Donovan, still as stony calm, but there was something new in his eyes, the doom of a hunted animal. "Your fingerprints are on Ray's bank card," Donovan began. "The card Sarah planned to use to withdraw his savings." Kevin was silent. "You knew about her plan, maybe even helped in it. $8,000 for a new life in California wasn't a bad start." Still silence. "What happened that night, Kevin? Did she change her mind about going with you? Or did you find out that she was planning to cheat on you too?" Kevin looked up, tired, flushed. "She never loved me." His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "I was just a transportation, a way to get out of this town. Did she tell you that?" Kevin nodded. "That night, after I talked to Jenny, I drove to Sarah's house. I wanted to make sure she still wanted to leave with me, that Jenny was lying." He fell silent, immersing himself in memories. The house on the edge of town, the lights in the windows, Sarah opening the door, so beautiful in her simple house dress, her hair disheveled, her surprise turning to annoyance. "She wasn't expecting me. She was packing, nervous. I asked if she was ready to leave, and then—" Kevin took a deep breath, trying to deal with his emotions. She laughed. "Said I was too soon, that she wasn't done here yet, that she needed Ray's money, and then she'd find someone better, with more prospects. Maybe Hollywood, baby. There's plenty of producers there who like people like me." Donovan listened in silence. The story was coming together like pieces of a mosaic. "I told her I loved her, that I'd do anything to make her happy," Kevin continued. "She just laughed, said people like me were just stepping stones, that Ray was a stepping stone, that I was a stepping stone, that all men were just a way for her to get where she wanted to go." "And you've lost control," Donovan said quietly. Not a question, an assertion. Kevin lowered his head. "I don't remember how it started. All I remember is her laughing. She kept laughing and laughing, even when I grabbed her by the shoulders, saying I was pathetic, that she never needed me. His hands, the big, strong hands of a man used to hard physical labor, clenched into fists. And then I saw her on the floor, and the blood. I didn't mean it, I swear. I just, lost myself for a minute. There was a heavy silence in the room. A love story turned tragic. Dreams of a new life shattered by harsh reality.